Hey, my name's Joe Gilder. If this is the first time you're watching a video from me, hi. I've been running this channel since 2009. Lots of great resources here. And today we're going to talk about a specific tool called Dynamic EQ. We're going to talk about what Dynamic EQ is. We'll talk about how it fits or where it fits into your bag of tricks, how to think about Dynamic EQ, when to use it, or at least when I like to use it, and a huge mistake most people make when it comes to tools like Dynamic EQ. But first, I got a fun announcement. I'm doing a free compression masterclass. Oh, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about it. Compression can be really confusing for a lot of people. It can be the thing that kind of makes or breaks your mixes. You need to have a deep understanding of it to get good mixes. If you find yourself just turning knobs and praying for the best, probably not the best approach. So this masterclass is for you. It'll help you be not confused anymore about compression and how to use compression like a pro. We'll talk about why we use compression. We'll talk about what does compression actually sound like? What is it actually doing to the sound? How do I know how to hear that? And then how do I use that information to help me make better compression decisions in the future? We'll talk about a better way to think about compression. I'll share with you my simple 7-part compression formula to get you started. And there'll even be a Q&A session. This is limited time only, so hurry. There'll be a Q&A session as well where you can ask your compression questions and get answers from me. It's all for free. Just go to homestudiocorner.com/compression to get in on the action. Okay, so I got these questions recently. And they were back-to-back questions, so I knew it was meant to be, and I needed to do this video. The first was from Marcus, who said, can you please make a video on how to use Dynamic EQ and de-esser? I've seen it. Sounds convincing. I'm not sure I can handle it. Appreciate the honesty. And then Lawsreeve2780 says, basically, same thing. I understand the concept of Dynamic EQ, but how do you actually apply it? Is there a particular plugin? Do you have any videos on Dynamic EQ? So I believe I've talked about Dynamic EQ on the Personas channel, the specific one that comes with Studio One. We're going to talk about it from a bigger perspective as a tool, and I'll show you some specifics of how I use it. But first, we got to make sure that you and I are on the same page. There are essentially, when I think about Dynamic EQ, it comes alongside these 5 other tools that I use all the time in mixing. The first is, of course, EQ. EQ, we're dealing with frequencies. Compression, we're doing police work from a dynamic standpoint. Multiband compression, which in Studio One it's called multiband dynamics, which is a type of compression, but it's not the same as regular compression. Then there's a de-esser, which is when you compress a vocal and the S's become really loud. That's a byproduct of compression. We can deal with that with a de-esser, and it's very simple and works really well. And then dynamic EQ. So where does Dynamic EQ fall into this category? And the question of the day is, do you use all 5 of these already? If so, which one's your favorite? And if not, which one do you want to experiment with next? So quick overview of these. EQ, of course, is just boosting and cutting frequencies. Just about all of us know what EQ is and what it does. Compression, a little more confusing. It has to do with when the volume crosses a threshold, we turn it back down in a certain way that controls dynamics and also creates a cool sound. Talk about more about that in the masterclass. Multiband compression is as if we took a compressor and said, instead of 1 compressor, I want 3 compressors. I want 1 on the lows, 1 on the mids, and 1 on the highs. This one only listens to low frequencies and only compresses low frequencies. This one only does the same to the mid frequencies, and this one only does the same to the high frequencies. They're literally independent of one another. So if there's a big loud thing that happens in the mid-range, like a guitar solo, let's say, it only compresses and brings down those mid frequencies without touching the lows and the highs. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. De-esser, I already explained. De-esser is kind of a form of multiband compression or sidechain compression, depending on how the de-esser works, where it's really only listening to those annoying high frequencies and responding to those. And then dynamic EQ, kind of, it's hard to like pin it down. It's EQ because it's in the name, but it's dynamic, so it's doing some compression. So what in the world? I will admit, Dynamic EQ has been around for a long time. I didn't use it until it made its way into Studio One, into the stock Pro EQ compressor. Was I against it? No. I just have this thing, maybe you can relate. You probably can't, but some people can, where I just want to use what's in my software. Call me simple, call me maybe stubborn, but I just don't get excited about buying a bunch of plugins that all somewhat do the same thing. I'm not saying they're bad, or I'm not even saying that perhaps I'm missing out, but I'm just content to use what's built in because I feel like I get more excitement out of making great music than I do using different tools to still make the same great music, because the difference for me is up here and in here and in here, not so much out there with what specific tool I'm using. That said, I have amended my ways many times over the years. There was a season where I didn't use tuning on my vocals because I didn't think I needed it. Turns out I needed it. There was a time when I didn't use analog style EQs and compressors. Turns out they're pretty cool. And again, I used them because they were built into Studio One. So am I a Studio One fanboy? Of course. But it also is it's just my personality. I just like to have a simple setup. When I set up Studio One on a new computer, I like the fact that once it's installed, I've got all my stuff. I don't have to go download installers for 18,000 different plugin companies and get them all working and making sure it's not having bugs. And a lot of the problems I see people having online with using their DAW relate to using a bunch of third-party plugins. Just saying. I'm not against them. I just don't personally use them. Okay, so when do I use each of these tools? It's helpful to kind of categorize these to think, okay, this is when I use this. Now, of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but in general, here's how I use things. EQ, that is for frequency balance. You'll notice that all of these have to do with a form of balance. Balance is what we do. We are balance engineers, by the way. So frequency balance is adjusting lows, mids, highs, getting those in line. You may think, hold on, isn't that what dynamic EQ is doing? We'll get there. Compression is balancing dynamics and also shaping the tone. So when a vocal goes real loud and real quiet, compression makes the loud one quieter, the quiet one louder, so it's a little more in a similar volume, so it's easier to listen to over a mix, for example. Multiband compression, I typically only use multiband compression in mastering, and not even all the time. So it's one of the ones that I use the least, at least currently. I used to use it more, but I don't even use it that much in mastering anymore. De-esser is 90% used on just vocals when there's a sibilance there, as the name implies, but it can be used for just any annoying high-frequency stuff that happens. That's just an intermittent high-frequency thing. So I've used it on acoustic guitar when there's a bunch of squeaks, right? That squeaky sound that happens when you slide your finger up the strings. If it's to the point where it's annoying, one of the easy ways to deal with that is to use a de-esser because it just grabs those high frequencies. I've used it on really spiky lead guitar parts where everything else sounds great, but there's certain just some random combination of the way the pick hits the string, the way the amp was set up, and just this kind of spiky, hard sound comes through. A de-esser can be kind of cool there. So it's a tool that's mainly used for one thing, but you can use it for other similar problems as well. And then there's dynamic EQ, which I use to fix intermittent frequency problems. What does that mean? Intermittent means it's not a steady, constant problem on the vocal, for example. It's a problem that only comes up occasionally. What does that mean? Well, if you think of EQ, if I do an EQ that looks like this, that's a permanent EQ on that track. Yes, we can automate EQ, but I never do. So if I do an EQ that has this big, deep cut, that's going to be a deep cut across the vocal for the entire length of the song. It's quote-unquote permanent. But what if that EQ, that frequency that's bothering me, only happens when the singer sings, let's say, an E vowel sound? So vocal sounds great otherwise, but when the singer sings me, there's this E that comes through that makes the vocal sound terrible and it jumps out of the mix. I really just want that E part to be turned down, and specifically just those upper mid-range frequencies of that vocal when that sound happens. So I don't need that EQ notch everywhere. I really just need it when it becomes a problem. So that's an intermittent problem that only happens certain times. Here's a better example. Bass guitar. I don't know if it's a function of the bass player or the guitar itself. I don't know if cheaper bass guitars do this, or I'm not sure exactly what it is. But there are times where you're mixing a song and the bass feels perfect except one note on the bass. Like when the bass player goes and plays the B, for some reason, that one note throughout the entire song is louder than everything else. There could be a number of factors. I'm not entirely sure what, but it happens. So it's like doom, 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 do, doom, 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 do. It just, something about it makes it jump out more than the others. You could use compression, because if it's really just louder than everything else, that could work. Or you could perhaps use dynamic EQ honed in on that exact note, right? Because musical notes are just frequencies, right? So you figure out, actually, let me show you. In Studio One, there's a view that I can use called the 12th octave view, which actually gives me a piano note. So if it was a B on the bass, I could say, I think it's right here. So I could maybe make some sort of dynamic, whoops, not that one. I don't need the low cut. I need like this one right here. I stole this one for this. I could find a dynamic EQ that goes kind of right here. That's right on that B, and I could say, just turn that down when that gets out of hand. And it's just as simple as that. So that's a better example. I don't use that much because it doesn't, once I've done all the stuff I'm going to do to the bass, it doesn't seem to have huge problems like that. But occasionally when it does, that's a potential solution. That's an example of an intermittent frequency problem, right? It's a problem with a certain bunch of frequencies, but it doesn't happen consistently throughout the song. It's only in certain moments in the song. Dynamic EQ is perfect for that. All right, so I'm going to come back to that mistake. Let me go through and kind of show you dynamic EQ and the ways that I would use it. So I'm going to start over on this vocal. I'm going to go back to kind of just the default settings. And this is a vocal I used in the previous video as well. So here's the vocal. Wise men say, though never understood. First thing I want to do is maybe do a low shelf just to kind of get make sure the vocal's not too warm or boomy. Wise men say. Okay, that's pretty good. I talked about this in the last video. There's an upper mid thing happening on this voice. This is me singing. That's kind of annoying. That right up in there. It's up in this frequency range. Let me emphasize it for you. I'll turn it way down so it doesn't hurt your ears. Wise men say, wise men say. It's a whistliness that just happens when someone sings loudly. I've yet to find a singer that doesn't happen to at least a little bit. So one thing I could do, I could just use EQ and I could just pull that down. Wise men say. That sometimes makes the vocal sound thin on every other note. So maybe I'm trying to be more hands-off on this vocal. Instead of doing that normal EQ move, I might use dynamic EQ. And so dynamic EQ lets me basically set the EQ curve so I can still set it to be really narrow, right? To be honed in on this exact set of frequencies. But instead of having it permanent like that, I put the EQ at 0, so it's not currently doing anything. I turn on the dynamic part of the EQ, which gives me these controls, and then I can say, here's how much I want you to turn it down. I'm just going to go all the way because I want it to be aggressive. And then here's kind of when you turn it down. When it gets to a certain level, I want you to turn that down. So right now at this setting, let's see what it does. We can see it move when the vocal sings. Wise men say, wise men say. So not much is happening yet, so it's really leaving it alone. So let's just go really aggressive and see what happens. Let's bring that threshold way down. Wise men say, they'll never understand. That's pretty aggressive, so we could maybe split the difference perhaps. I still hear that whistle there, so let's go a little more aggressive. Wise men say. And while we're doing this, we might say, well, let's just widen this up a little bit as well. Wise men say. So here it is without the dynamic. Here it is with. Wise men say. Now this one, we actually discovered this in the last video. There's a second whistle happening up here. Wise men say. So I would maybe do two, let's just for giggles, let's do a second one here. Wise men say, they'll never understood. Okay, so I have that vocal kind of quiet. When I turn it back up to normal volume, it now can be nice and loud without having that thing that makes me go, ooh, that's a little harsh. Wise men say. Versus this. There we go. That's literally why I use dynamic EQ, is to make my face not do that. when something gets to a loud part. A lot of times, it's not that the vocal's too loud. It's not that it needs compression. It's not that I need to turn the vocal down. It's just those specific frequencies are being selfish and are jumping out above everybody else saying, listen to me. And so I have to tame them down. I don't need to tame them down for every single word the vocal sings, especially over here. Right? That's a nice, quiet vocal. It doesn't need those frequencies turned down. And as you can see, they're mostly not. That's kind of the beauty of dynamic EQ. Now, here's kind of a bonus thing. Sometimes I like to use dynamic EQ for my de-essing as well, just because I'm already using it. So let's take this frequency band. Where is the sibilance happening? Wise men say, right there, kind of, this one's centering around about 8K or so. So I'm going to have an EQ, a wider EQ this time, because I want to grab more frequencies. And I'm going to say, turn that down. Say, wise men say. So that might be grabbing too many lower frequencies, so we might narrow that down a little bit. Let's go from here. Wise men say. Wise men say. Now the S's aren't bothering me, and this vocal can be nice and up front on top of the entire mix, and it feels real good. Wise men say. We could even turn it up a little more now that we've dealt with those issues. Wise men say, though never understood. So there you go. That is when and where I like to use dynamic EQ. You can come up with a lot of scenarios, but that's the idea. There's this frequency that is a problem. Sometimes I would like to hire someone to deal with that frequency when it becomes a problem sometimes. Now the question would be, why not use multiband on this? So here's a multiband compressor. Let's put it on there. The problem with multiband, this one is, I've set it up to have 3 bands, is it's all or nothing. So if I was going to try to go after that 2600 hertz range, most multibands have a limit of the width that they can use. So if I'm looking to try to get right in here in the middle, this multiband is going to basically affect everything between 2.2K and 4.2K. That's a big range. So it's not going to hone in on that specific whistly sound. It's going to kind of take the whole group, which is why this can be helpful more in a mastering scenario where I want like a bigger, gentler kind of, let's keep each big range of frequencies in check. But when we're talking about going after specific frequencies, dynamic or multiband dynamics or multiband EQ just isn't really the right tool for the job. Okay, so here's a big mistake that people tend to make when they introduce themselves to cool tools like dynamic EQ. It's a cool tool. You're a cool toy. 90% of the time, the solution to the problem you're trying to solve has a simple solution, and that solution is level, EQ, or compression. Meaning, there's something wrong with the bass. It might just be you need to turn it down or up. That's level. It might just be the EQ balance isn't right. That's EQ. It might be that it's just too dynamic. Let's solve that with compression. As boring as those things are, level, EQ, and compression, I don't know what those hand symbols are the answer to 90% of the problems you face in a mix. Mixing is exciting, is fun. You've got all these tools you want to use, but a lot of times the answer is the simple, boring tools. 10% of the time, I need to reach for something like a dynamic EQ, a multiband compressor, a de-esser, things like that. That's why if you watch me mix through a song start to finish, you'll notice I might use a dynamic EQ in 2 spots where I might use actual EQ in 20 spots, right? That math works out exactly right. So that's very much true of the way that I mix. It's probably closer to like 95.5 or something like that. The takeaway is, do not create complicated solutions to simple problems. I'm in a unique position where I see this all the time. I will teach a concept, give a very simple, here's how to do it, and people say, but what about, and then they insert complicated solution to a simple problem. It's natural, it's human nature, it's you wanting to think your way out of a simple problem using complicated tools. It's 9 times out of 10, it's a lot simpler than you think. It's just level, it's just compression, it's just EQ. All right, if you like this video, you'll love my 6 rules of compression video. Gives you a nice deep understanding of what kind of approach do I take when using compression, what are some boundaries, some guidelines that I use. Also, if you did not sign up for that masterclass, there's still time. The video should be available even if this is a long time in the future. So go to homestudiocorner.com/compression, get your free copy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.